Sexagesima, second Sunday before Lent. O Lord God, who seest that we put not our trust in anything that we do, mercifully grant that by thy power we may be defended against all adversity. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Hymn 120, verse 1, an Epiphany. The sinless one to Jordan came, and in the river shared our stain. God's righteousness he thus fulfilled, and chose the path his Father willed. Well, we turn to the life of Archbishop George Abbot, Dr. Abbot. His character by Right Honorable Arthur Onslow, late Speaker of the House of Commons. He's a namesake of the county in which I live, Onslow County, reminiscent of the days when Carolina was a part of the Commonwealth before the American Rebellion and homicides. Which there's a description of the hospital which he erected and endowed in his native town of Guildford in Surrey. Copies of the statutes of the same, his will, to which are added the lives of his two brothers, Robert Abbot, who was the Bishop of Salisbury, and Sir Maurice Abbot, Lord Mayor of the City of London. This was published in 1777, and it belongs to somebody's historical medical library. Robert Taverner, or Travers, I should say. The author of the lives were compiled. I guess he did a bunch of writing. List of errata common in these books. The life of Abbot, Archbishop Abbot. George Abbot was born October 29, 1562 at Guildford in Surrey. A very worthy parents, remarkably distinguished by their steady zeal for the Protestant religion, for their living long and happily together, and their singular felicity in their children. It's got the old English with the S and the Fs. When his mother was pregnant with this son, she is said to have had a dream which proved at once an omen and an instrument of his future fortunes. Her dream was this, and then we've got a footnote here of some length here. Mr. Maurice Abbot, who was by trade a cloth worker, and settled at the town of Guildford in Surrey, where he married his wife Alice March, and suffered for his steadfastness in the Protestant religion, though through the means of Dr. Story, who was a great persecutor of such persons in the reign of Queen Mary. But their storms being blown over, they passed the remainder of their days quietly, living together 58 years. She deceased September 15, 1606, and he September 25, the same year, a week, 10 days later. The former being 80 and the latter 86 years of age. They left behind 6 sons, of whom Robert, the eldest, who was then king, one of the king's chaplains, George, who'd been thrice chancellor of Oxford, and their youngest, for Maurice, was this time an eminent merchant of the city of London. 6 sons, and they just named 3 of them. She fancied she was told in her sleep that it would, if she could eat a jack or a pike, the child she went up with would prove a son and rise to great preferment. Not long after this, in taking a pail of water out of the river of Wey, which ran by their house, she accidentally caught a jack and had thus an opportunity of fulfilling her dream. This story being much talked of and coming to the ears of some persons of distinction, they offered to become sponsors for the child, which was kindly accepted, and they had the goodness to afford many testimonies of their affection to their godson while at school and after he was sent to the university. Such was the good effects of his mother's dream. When he'd grown up to an age proper for receiving the first tincture of learning, he was sent with his elder brother Robert to the free school erected in their native town of Guildford by King Edward VI. And having passed through the rudiments of literature under the care of Mr. Francis Taylor, with then the direction of that school, he was in 1578 removed to the University of Oxford and entered a student in Balliol College. On November 29, 1583, being then a Bachelor of Arts, he was elected probationer fellow of his college, and afterwards proceeding in the faculties of arts, he entered into holy orders and became a celebrated preacher in the university. He commenced Bachelor of Divinity in 1593 and proceeded to doctor in that faculty 1597. And in the month of September of the same year, he was elected Master of University College. About this time, it was that the first differences began between him and Dr. Laud, which subsisted as long as they lived and was the cause of great uneasiness to both. On March 6, 1599, he was installed Dean of Winchester in the room of Dr. Martin Heaton, who was preferred to the bishopric of Ely. Dr. Abbot being then about 37 years of age. In 1600, he was Vice Chancellor of the University of Oxford and distinguished himself while in that high office by the opinion he gave with respect to the setting up again of the cross in Cheapside, about which there were great disputes, but in the end he carried his point against Dr. Bancroft, then Bishop of London and afterwards Archbishop of Canterbury, which gained him a reputation as appears by a tract published on that subject. The cross was taken down in the year 1600 in order to be repaired, and upon this occasion the citizens of London desired the advice of both universities on this question, whether the said cross should be erected or not. And Dr. Abbot, as Vice Chancellor of Oxford, gave it his opinion that the crucifix with a dove on it should not be set up, but approved rather of a pyramid or some other matter of mere ornament, for the reasons assigned in his letter. In this determination he acted consistently with his own practice, when in his said office he caused several superstitious pictures to be burnt at the marketplace of Oxford, and among the rest one of which was the figure of God the Father over a crucifix ready to receive the soul of Christ. And he professes in this letter that he was moved to such proceedings by his own observation and experience. I remember, says he, in that college, Balliol, where I first lived, a young man was taken praying and beating his breast before the crucifix in a window, which caused the master and fellows to pull it down and set up other glass. Which example makes me nothing doubt but that the cross in Cheapside have many in the twilight, morning early, who do reverence it, besides Campion, whose act is famous, or rather infamous for it. And I am informed that so much hath been ignited by the neighbors, or signified by the neighbors, or inquest, making presentments concerning the circumstance of this cause, by all of which I do conclude that it is a monument of their superstition, a great inducement, and may be ready way to idolatry, that there can be no tolerable use of the matter which may be able to countervail. In 1603, he was again chosen Vice Chancellor of the university and discharged that office for a second time with general approbation. In 1605, he was the third time Vice Chancellor. In In the succeeding year, he is said to have had a great share in the troubles of Laud, who was called to account by the Vice-Chancellor, Dr. Airy, for a sermon of his preached before the university. And that year, likewise, he lost his father and mother. In 1608 died the great patron Thomas Sackville, Earl of Dorset, Lord High Treasurer of England and Chancellor of the University of Oxford, suddenly at the council table, at whose funeral Dr. Abbot preached a sermon, which was afterwards printed and generally commended. After his decease, Dr. Abbot became chaplain to George Hume, Earl of Dunbar and Treasurer of Scotland, one of King James' early favorites. A very high share in his esteem, and with him he went this year into Scotland in order to assist in the execution of the very important design for establishing an union between the churches in that kingdom. And this wherein he behaved with so much prudence and moderation as gained him a very high character and thought the first steps to his future preferments. There's a footnote. There's no point in which all the writers who mention this prelate clearly agree on this, that his journey to Scotland brought him into that height of favor with the king, who so suddenly raised him in little more than 3 years from Dean of Winchester to Archbishop of Canterbury. Yet it has so fallen out that hitherto his transactions in Scotland have lain so much in the dark that it's a very difficult thing to discern how he merited by them so high a share of the royal favor. To explain, therefore, this untouched point and set this matter in a clear light shall be the business of this note, the rather because it will show how unjustly this great man has been charged with unfriendliness to the establishment of the Church of England and the coldness in regard to the hierarchy. King James had suffered so much for his accession to the crown of England from the spirit and power of the Presbyterians in Scotland that he was so greatly set on restoring the ancient form of government by bishops in that kingdom, the care of which was principally entrusted to the Earl of Dunbar, to whom Dr. Abbot was now chaplain. That noble lord, who is by all writers allowed to have been both the wisest and best man of all the favorites of that nation, had proceeded so far in this matter 2 years before as to obtain an act for the restitution of the estates of bishops. But the Presbyterians made so steady a resistance that the consequences which were hoped from the restoring of that order were in the utmost danger of being disappointed. But the skill and prudence, the sound sense and great moderation of Dr. Abbot, these difficulties were removed, and the clergy of Scotland, who had refused to admit the bishops for the moderators of their church synods, were brought to a better temper, and things were put in such a train as afterwards produced the entire establishment of the Episcopal order in Scotland, for which the king had been so long. And then that's while he was at Edinburgh upon this occasion. Okay, we're back to another footnote on the account given by the famous historian of the Church of Scotland, David Calderwood, sufficiently proves the truth of what has been asserted. About the end of June 1608, says he, the Earl of Dunbar came from court, and with him 2 English doctors, Abbot and Higgins. Dr. Maxey, one of the king's chaplains, came by sea. It was reported that no small sums of money were sent down with him to be distributed among the munificers and some others. The English doctors seemed to have no direction but to persuade the Scots that there was no substantial difference in religion between the realms, but only in things indifferent concerning government and ceremonies, and to report that it was His Majesty's will that England should stand as he found it, and Scotland as he left it. But when he came to St. Andrews, Mr. Robert Howey, a man of seditious and turbulent spirit, declaimed against the discipline and government of our kirk, and then they uttered their mind in plain terms. No order was taken in so manifest a breach after the last conference. This was the policy of the aspiring bishops, to cry peace, peace, and to crave silence of their opposites, when in the meantime they minded not to be silent themselves when they found occasion. This very clearly proves that it was by a kind and moderate, not haughty and severe behavior, that the English doctor, as he calls Dean Abbot, was so much upon the Scots ministers as to bring them into a compliance with the king's desires, so that in 2 years afterwards the Lord High Treasurer Dunbar, who was entirely governed in this matter by the advice of his able chaplain, procured an act in the General Assembly by which it was provided that the king should have the calling of all general assemblies, that bishops or their deputies should be in perpetual moderators of the diocesan synods, that no excommunication or absolution should be pronounced without their approbation, that all presentations of benefices should be made by them, and that deprivation or suspension of ministers should belong to them, that every minister at his admission to a benefice should take the oath of supremacy and canonical obedience, that the visitation of the diocese shall be performed by the bishop or his deputy only, and finally that the bishop should be moderator of all conventions for exercising. Get back to the prosecution, back to the narrative. Out of the footnote, prosecution was commenced against one George Sprott, notary of Weymouth, for having been concerned in Gowrie's conspiracy 8 years before, for which he was tried before Sir William Hart. Lord Justice General of Scotland condemned and executed. A large account of this affair was drawn up by the judge, and a narrative prefixed thereto by Dr. Abbot, who had been an eyewitness of all that passed, and this was published at London in order to settle the minds of the people with regard to the conspiracy, which had hitherto been looked upon as a very mysterious affair, and about the reality of which there were great doubts. Back to another footnote. All which were afterwards ratified and confirmed by the Parliament of that kingdom. Such were the merits of Dr. Abbot in this respect, and so great justice was there done to them by his noble patron, the treasurer, in the report he made to His Majesty of the dean's behavior in this respect, that in conjunction with the service rendered His Majesty by giving his unquestioned testimony in the affair of Gowrie's conspiracy, he was raised so high and so firmly fixed in the esteem of his royal master as that no opposition could prevent his arriving at the supreme dignity in his profession. As proof of his advancing his fortune by this means, and not otherwise, it may not be amiss to transcribe the observation of a contemporary historian after Dr. Abbot was raised to the archiepiscopal dignity, who tells us that the first preacher and the first in the embassage which King James sent into Scotland to establish those neighboring churches was he, whose eminency for both place and piety is now worthily foremost in guiding our own and whole blessed travels in that service, as they were acceptable to God, His Majesty, and that nation. So are they a document to others how powerful and admirably successful true learning is, where it is guided with true prudence, and where piety and the love of God's glory is linked with charity and zeal of men's good. Back to the narrative. The king knew so well of the difficult. Then we got another long footnote. To give a clear account of this matter within the short compass of a note, and yet the importance as well as the curiosity of the subject, very obscurely treated by most of our historians, as well as its close connection with the history of Dean Abbot's life, rendered absolutely necessary. The conspiracy was framed by John, Earl of Gowrie, son of that Earl of Gowrie who had been executed for surprising the king's person at Ruthin Castle in 1584, and carried on with great diligence and secrecy. The scheme was to invite the king, upon some pretense or other, to the earl's house at Perth, and there to make sure of him. The design was executed on Tuesday, August 5, 1600, when the king was brought thither by Mr. Alexander Ruthin, brother to the earl, and accompanied by some persons of quality, under pretense of feeling some chemical experiment. And for this purpose, after dinner, being brought to a chamber at the top of the house, Mr. Alexander Ruthin shut the door and suddenly fell to upbraiding the king with the death of his father, for which he was now to make some satisfaction. And after this speech left him for some time to the mercy of the executioner, who refused to do that office, although Alexander returning had, if the man had not hindered him. But the king was much struggling, got at last to a window and cried out so loud that the lords and the gentlemen of the retinue heard him and came to his assistance. The earl himself was killed by Sir Thomas Erskine, the captain of the king's guard, as he was going to help his brother, and Alexander Ruthin was dispatched by Ramsay, one of the king's pages, who, being well acquainted with the house, came by the back stairs time enough to preserve his master. When the ministers of Edinburgh were desired to assemble the people and give God thanks for this deliverance, they excused themselves as not acquainted with the particulars. When they were pressed only to make known to the people that the king had escaped a great danger, to excite them to thanksgiving, they answered that they were not very well satisfied as to the truth of the matter, and that nothing was to be uttered in the pulpit but that which might be spoken in faith. Upon this, the council ordered the Bishop of Ross to assemble the people, to declare the whole affair, and to make a prayer of thanksgiving, which was done accordingly. In November following, a parliament was held in Edinburgh, in which the estate of Gowrie was confiscated. I guess maybe we will call it at that point. Verse 2 of hymn 120. Uprising from the waters there, the Father's voice did then declare that Christ the Son of God had come to lead his scattered people home. Let us pray. Blessing and honor, and glory and power be unto him that sitteth upon the throne, and unto the Lamb forever and ever. Amen. Godspeed.